Okay, we are here with Glen Murray. Hi, everyone. It is 6:30, so we're about ready to start here. I'll just see if we can get Glen's audio and video on here. There you are.
There I am. How are you guys?
I'm well. How are you?
I am really good. You can probably tell by the lighting in here. It's a little darker on the prairies already. So.
Oh yeah. Just about all of the ones we've done, everyone's been in total darkness. It was one of the ones we did, Judy Green, and it was pitch black in the window behind her. It's like, man, it's like midnight there when we finished.
Yeah.
Cool. So for everyone who's watching who doesn't know me by now, my name's Derek. I am the secretary for the Nanaimo Ladysmith Electoral District Association, and I'm here with Glen Murray, just hosting from the traditional territories of the Nanaimo First Nations is where I am, and I will let Glen introduce himself.
Well, thanks. My name is Glen Murray. I am here in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory, and very famously the capital of the Métis Nation, and home to Canada's first Bill of Rights, written by Louis Riel. Do you want to just tell you, just take a minute to introduce myself? What would you like me to do there?
Yeah, sorry, you just go ahead and I guess you could, what we've done with most of the other candidates is anything that you think that the voters of Nanaimo Ladysmith and anyone you might send this video to later from your areas should know about the campaign you're running in general, because we're going to get into all the issues and stuff, but
Okay.
what the reasons you're sort of running and what you want to see for the Green Party.
So I first got involved in politics in Montreal. Je suis né à Montréal, dans le quartier de Rosemont. J'ai milité dans le mouvement étudiant. Je suis un organisateur d'une grève nationale au Québec pour geler les frais scolaires, which is, so I got very involved in student politics. I was president of my university student association in Quebec, fought fights to freeze tuition successfully. J'ai milité dans le Rassemblement des citoyens et citoyennes de Montréal. I got very involved with the Montreal Citizens Movement, which was one of the first big progressive, sustainable development, transport en commune, public transit, integrated development kind of models. I was studying urban studies at Concordia University. Then that kind of activism led me into, did work for the Canadian Labour Congress. When the Human Rights Charter came out, I was working on collective rights, so not looking at it from the perspective that a lot of people were, which is important, individual rights, but looking at how municipalities, women, class action suits, how unions, any kind of collective action or agreements would be affected by a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And that was kind of exciting. And then the Conservatives got elected and all the funding for my project was canceled. Started working at, was very involved with the AIDS movement, founded one of the founding members of the Canadian AIDS Society. I have a long life, it's so hard to put it together quickly. Got very involved in activism with AIDS Action Now, founded something called Village Clinic, which is now known as Nine Circles Community Health Center, worked there, built street outreach programs, set up the first clean needle exchange program, eventually became safe injection sites, worked with street involved people, fostered and adopted street kids because they had no place to go. So did a lot of parenting of pretty challenging, brilliant and complicated kids that had, my typical workday was at the clinic all day, and then I'd go out at 9 o'clock at night to about 3 o'clock in the morning working on the streets in downtown Winnipeg, doing a lot of work within the Indigenous community and women who were street involved. It was a complicated community, it taught me a lot. Got involved with the Canadian AIDS Society, founding that, one of the founding members of it, worked internationally with the Global Program on AIDS, Africa and Europe, on the AIDS service organizations during the first big pandemic. I lost 43 friends to AIDS in my 20s, got very involved in gay, lesbian, transgender rights, co-chaired 14 years old in Montreal, started one of the first gay, lesbian youth groups in Canada, co-chaired the initiative in Manitoba for sexual orientation, the Human Rights Charter, and in Ontario. Got involved in civic politics, hooked up with Jane Jacobs, started doing a lot of collaborative work with her, created the C5 City Hub Network, got elected in the 80s, was one of the first openly gay men, was one of the first openly gay people in the world to get held elected office in the mid 1980s, eventually became mayor of my city, got elected 5 times without any political brand, which in the 80s and 90s was quite an accomplishment. Eventually worked for the State Department on regional economic development. If someone wants to know about that, I can get into that. That was an interesting period of time. Was appointed by U of T, the University of Toronto, to help to build the city center, was a fellow at the Faculty of Architecture and Landscape Design, wrote for the Toronto Star, started working with David Crombie at the Canadian Urban Institute, very quickly became the CEO. Created an organization in my living room called Rainbow Railroad, which gets gay, lesbian, transgender, non-binary people out of countries around the world, saves hundreds of people's lives, people escaping from Iran, Chechnya, Palestine, Jamaica, Uganda. We have an international network of safe houses. That probably gives you a lot. Oh yeah, I forgot, elected in Toronto, served in the McGuinty and Wynne governments. He was Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Transportation and Infrastructure simultaneously, Research and Innovation. Built some of the things. I'll close with some of the highlights. I was also CEO of the Pembina Institute in Calgary, chair of the Big City Mayor's Caucus, but in the Ontario cabinet, built the cap and trade system with California and Quebec, and the Under 2 MOU, which was 300 governments committed to very stringent reductions on climate change. The Quebec-California partnership was an incredibly complicated negotiation, but achieved the largest reductions in greenhouse gases in North America, about 20% in each of those jurisdictions in just a few years. Set up the phasing out of neonicotinoids, systemic neurotoxic pesticides that kill pollinators and bees. That legislation has now been copied in 17 states. Lots of stuff. First Circular Economy Act in North America, which commits the Ontario economy to shift to recovered resources from virgin resources over the next 20 years and achieves zero waste. So a remarkable, I think, resume as far as you pick an issue that's at the intersection of environment, human rights, and the economy, and I've probably involved in it in a major scale. And I think given the climate crisis that we face right now and the need for economic and social justice transition, I'm a candidate who brings an incredible amount of experience and ability to get things done. So that's probably much information, but I've done this a few times now, and it's been a complicated life, put it that way.
Yeah. It's a long list of credentials, my friend. Wow. So I'm sure anybody who's watching, there's a lot there that might have piqued their interest. So just feel free anytime you got a question about anything, fire away in the YouTube chat, and we will get to it. I promise you that. We've got some questions here that we want to make sure we get every single candidate through, but after that, it's sort of a free reign here.
Okay.
Cool.
Fire away, my friend.
Okie doke. So the first one that we've got here is about the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. I'll never know what it stands for. I forget every time. CERB. It's been a critical emergency measure to help Canadians weather the pandemic that we're in right now. But some folks have been criticizing it, saying that it's become a disincentive for low-income Canadians going back to work. So how would you see a guaranteed livable income being different? How would you implement a GLI to make sure that it isn't a disincentive to work? And what do you sort of see as the main benefits of a GLI?
Well, I guaranteed livable income is something I've been involved with before. The universal minimum income that was introduced in Ontario was a approach that I was quite involved in. It's very similar to what we as Greens call a GLI. It was structured very similarly. And what was interesting about it is because it's easy for a province to do it, because provinces have responsibility for social services constitutionally, it provides a good model. I built out of that experience. I've shared it with Paul Manley and Elizabeth May and Jenica Atwin. I wrote up something that I called Pathway End Poverty Now. It's basically a pathway to achieving a universal guaranteed income. It takes the Green Party's details of what has to be included in a guaranteed livable income, and then I put two tests to it, working with two friends who I've collaborated over the last 15 years with, doing this kind of social justice investment. It can be done entirely within federal constitutional authority. It lifts the vast majority of the 6 million people who live in poverty out of poverty. That includes students, who are increasingly one of the fastest growing folks who live in poverty. And even when they get incomes, their level of indebtedness reduces their actual take-home income. So it puts $9,120 into the pockets of every full-time student in any upper middle class, or low income family. It puts $6,240 in the pockets annually of every part-time student across the country, regardless of what you're studying. It does that as a refundable tax credit, which means that you're taking a tax credit and turning it into a direct grant that goes to people as a check. It does the same with seniors. It raises seniors' income between about 25 and 30%, raises every senior, the 1 in 3 seniors that live in poverty, significantly above the low income minimum. There's a Canadian workers benefit that takes all low income workers, and it increases their income quite dramatically, about $4,800, and lifts almost every low income worker, from a sales clerk to a personal support worker in the healthcare system. There is one for parents and kids. So if you have a preschool age children, if you're in Ontario, you have early childhood education. In Quebec, you have a very generous childcare program, but not 100%. This $500 a month that goes to per child, preschool child, and it declines a bit as the child gets older, would mean for the vast majority of Canadians, it would close the gap on the remaining childcare costs. There is an employment benefit for people on social assistance that would take all single people who are on social assistance and give them a significant increase in their income. That's the only one that involves some negotiation with provinces. And the final one is Canadian care benefit, which applies to people with disabilities. And it does not, many of the programs in place for people who are differently able have a lot more to do with access than just income. So it builds on top of that as a direct $7,200 grant. So it basically achieves all of the outcomes that the Green Party, that our party has argued for, and does it within the fiscal constraints of that. It redirects 93% of the revenue for it comes from what are called fiscal expenditures, which are the funded taxes and tax incentives, mostly used by corporations. It redirects them. It adds a couple of taxes. The two most significant ones are a 5% increase on incomes of over $250,000, and it raises the bank taxation corporate tax rate on banks by 7%, which brings it up to the US level, and that completely funds it. There's 100 pages of costing and research documents. I wrote it so that the caucus could walk it into Chrystia Freeland. Having been a cabinet minister, it is more detailed than any cabinet sub I ever did, and it is possible that it could be included in a federal budget within the next 60 days if the Green Party caucus decides to use it as a what is basically a ministerial level complete document. It's written so that the finance deputy could pick it up and put it in the budget.
Wow, very, very complete and actionable, it sounds like. Lori, for everyone watching who's moderating on YouTube right now, has shared the link to Glens End Poverty Now program in the chat, if anyone wants to check it out in all of its full detail. And I did just want to go back to the question, because the question was actually, and you covered most of it. It's just I felt like you might not have got the part where we're talking about it being, does criticism of a GLI being a disincentive?
Oh, it's just not. I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, all the evidence in Ontario, and I mean, part of the reason we did it as a pilot project in Ontario was to prove that it doesn't. And a lot of people who benefit from it like seniors, aren't going right back into the economy, and students who are in year one of their degree aren't going right back into the economy on a full-time basis. And if you're so if you're paying let's say you make $10,000 a year as a student, you're paying $1,500 in taxes. Even if you get 100% tax write-off, you're still not getting very much. But with a refundable tax credit of $9,120, if you make $10,000, you're going to get enough. There's enough basic tax write-offs that you're going to keep your $10,000. This will basically double your income for most students. So that's how it works. And that's just such a ridiculous argument. There's no evidence to support it. The Ontario experience that went on for a few years proves it's not true.
Yeah.
It's really just absolutely utter nonsense.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you said that, because you look at every single one of these programs and pilot programs that's been run, and that's people go back to school, you know?
Our challenge as Greens isn't that we don't have good ideas or great policies. We just can't clearly explain how we're going to implement them. And my politics are about as progressive as anyone's could possibly be. But there's a difference between simply running around saying I'm an eco-socialist and talking about that anything can be funded on debt, which doesn't invite serious conversation, doesn't get things passed. It's like what the NDP did, Bill 46. A dear friend of mine, Leah Kazan, who literally lives a few blocks away from me here in Winnipeg, who I really like and support her work. But there's what you basically got from the NDP is a shopping list of all the things the Greens have been arguing for years should be in a guaranteed livable income, with absolutely no mechanism to do it. So if you actually do your homework and you do the heavy lifting and you design it in a way that it can be done, you can walk to the Bloc, Quebecois, you can walk to the NDP, you can walk to the Liberals, and you could say, this does it. And by the way, it doesn't raise the deficit one penny. It literally doesn't. It's completely balanced. And it could be implemented within 60 days. And by Christmas, the Greens could take credit for getting 4 to 6 million people out of poverty, depending on how completely the Liberals and the other parties, how much of it they would support. And that's what we need to do. I mean, and we can win things really easily, but we've got to move beyond having the best ideas of any party, which I think we have, and having the best implementation plans of any party. Because the Liberals really don't know what to do post-Serbia. They're pretty much on panic mode as far as I can see. They're spending $720 billion a year right now, and they're taking in $340 billion a year, which is sustainable and something you need to do in a recession, but it's not sustainable over 10 years. So somebody has to come up with an intelligent answer, and we need serious political leadership. We need political leadership that says, yeah, you can do this, and here's how you do it. And this works without destroying your credit rating or having some 35-year-old MBA from your financial institutions that are advancing your government credit, telling you how to run your budget, which has happened to governments in Canada before when they get into serious financial problems.
Yeah, that's a really, really strong point you've got there. I mean, as a small party, the only way we get anything done is by making friends. But if we don't provide the actual path for that to happen, it's the likelihood of those things happening is diminishing, I can see. Yeah. Very cool. So the next question we've got is about drugs. What's your stance on drug prohibition, basically? Do you support decriminalizing or legalizing drugs in Canada? And what sort of approach would you support and why? We've seen success with things in different approaches, you know?
Well, I spent 12 years of my life starting in HIV and AIDS. And that took me I told you my typical work hours for most of my 20s was working at the clinic all day, doing buddy support, showing up at often a friend, because Winnipeg is that kind of small, big city, cooking meals, and then taking a break, and then 9 o'clock going out as part of a team on the streets with kids who were selling their bodies as early as 11 years old in the sex trade. And the other part of it was the fact that so much infection was going on, so much HIV was being transmitted because people were sharing needles. So the way you stop, the two things you got to give a lot of free condoms out. That's one part of the solution. The other one is you got to leave a lot of free needles out. So the free needles, which basically became the foundation for what eventually became safe injection sites, became really, really important to reducing infection. So it's complicated. You need a whole bunch of things to deal with it. It's not just a drug issue, you need a guaranteed livable income. You need the kind of housing programs that we did when I was mayor. We built 6,000 affordable housing. You need the kind of housing that people who have chemical dependency issues can be housed in. Every human being should in Canada have the right to a key to a safe place, dry, pleasant place to call home, free of violence. And that's particularly true for people struggling with a number of mental health and chemical dependency issues. So that's really important. A guaranteed livable income and psychosocial supports. If we spent half as much money on accessing mental health as we do in incarceration, we would be able to do this. So the other thing is you'd have to start a major shift in spending, moving people out of incarceration, which is sometimes the only place where people who are with addictions can actually get support. So you have to start shifting that. And then you need graduated decriminalization of drugs, but that often has to be done at a community by community level. So if we're talking about Garden Hill in First Nations community, the range of complexity and cultural issues about how that community would approach it would be very different than you would find in the center north end of downtown Winnipeg, where there's a different kind of dynamic, a different kind of economics, and a different types of drugs being used. When I first started working on the streets, Tallwin and Ritalin and speedballs were the problem, and you dealt with those very differently than you would deal with opioids or meth and some of the stuff that's out there now. So I don't like these simplistic answers. I think you have to bring that whole range of toolkits that I just mentioned. It has to be part of an integrated strategy because people need stability, they need confidence, they need safety, they need wellness, they need relationships. They need to be decriminalized, and there's a whole range of supports. I spent much of my life working in the community health centers, the community health and wellness networks. I worked very hard. There are now about 9 community health centers through central Winnipeg right now. 9 Circles, which is started as a very gay-centered one, is a very Indigenous-centered one now. That kind of model of an integrated comprehensive health center being the foundation of supports for interventions and dealing with that, I think is really important. So if I was trying to do this, I would do decriminalization, but I would do it in a staged way. And I would work with urban and rural and Indigenous community health workers and community health networks, and actually develop a strategy by listening to and working with people whose lives are in crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. You can't just say drugs are totally legal and then it's in different contexts that might be problematic. You can see it, and that makes sense going community by community. But yeah, having the supports, that's one of the biggest things.
Well, human relationship, I mean, we sometimes forget love is one of the most important aspects of being a human being, and hope. So creating a community of networks and relationships is also essential. And that's the part that doesn't usually get designed into government funding programs. And there's so many people who are doing what I did for 12 years, who understand these things. And there's so many people who have successfully gone through recovery, who have got stability and choice and freedom in their lives again. Those are the kinds of people you need to work with. And I've always worked with elders within an Indigenous cultural framework around these things. Art Shoffley, who sadly passed away, was a remarkable human being. So you need some value-based approach. And I think the healthiest one that I've experienced is an Indigenous approach to wellness. It's really remarkable. 9 Circles does it brilliantly well here in Winnipeg if people are looking for an example of how I believe we should approach it. But again, I put the big caveat, every community, every group of people, you have to start with their needs and their voices.
Yeah, that makes sense. 9 Circles, I'll be sure to check them out later. There's a lot in Indigenous practices that we've lost with the cultural genocide we've sort of gone through here. I find out more every day, it seems.
What's interesting, having lived in Toronto and been a politician in downtown Toronto, having been a city councillor in downtown Winnipeg, and that it's interesting in Winnipeg, it's so overwhelmingly, there's so an overwhelmingly powerful and pervasive Cree, Ojibwe, and Lakota culture that that it's very easy to build off of, because the resources of that community are very strong culturally, spiritually, from a comprehensive health perspective. The Thunderbird that we built in Winnipeg is a powerful foundation for changing lives and building community. I have my Cree name is Ishkan, which means leadership, but leadership in Cree is one who gathers people together, which is an interesting concept of healing and connecting. When I was in Toronto, I worked on a project that transferred a large pieces of land, $28 million, I think, if I remember, something like that, of land to Anishinaabe Health and to the Indigenous community there. But the community, though strong and large in Toronto, is not a dominant community the way it is in Toronto, is in Winnipeg. So the cultural approaches that you take there and the way Anishinaabe Health works in a context, again, is different. But Joe Hester there, who's the elder who I worked with, these are people that we need to listen to when we don't. The answers are there. The community has its own answers. We just have to have something more than funding programs. We have to have listening programs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of the idea of white savior complex, when you've got some NGOs who in the past have just sent in a bunch of people, set up projects. So here's your clean drinking water. And I used to fundraise for charities, and I heard the story, but they had this idea. They'd set up these a teeter-totter, and the idea was the kids would play on this and it would pump the water all day. And they went back 6 months later, and there was just these decrepit elders, grandmothers, pushing it with their hands to get the water. And they didn't have the skills given to them to rebuild it. They didn't recruit and ask these people, like, what do you need on the ground here? Yeah, cool. So the next question that we've got is about deficit, which I'm sure you'll have a comprehensive answer on this. So it's obviously been growing because of the pandemic in Canada. Is the deficit a big problem in your view? And some people also think that we'll have no choice to get out of this, but to bring in austerity measures. So do you think we can without bringing in cuts to programs? What would your approach be with this?
Well, no, this is something I've done a lot of work in. When I got elected mayor of Winnipeg, the city had the worst credit rating in the country, A-. It was verging on B+ junk bond status. When I left after 2 terms as mayor, it was AA positive, one of the highest credit ratings in the world. I significantly increased city spending. But I also cut the debt in half of the city over 6 years. And I cut taxes by about 8% because we had the highest per capita property taxes on the smallest, most low income houses. It was truly a regressive tax. But I got into all kinds of things. So we spent money the city had never spent money on. We paid and gave the land and built Red River College to bring post-secondary education close to inner city schools, because they'd moved all the universities and colleges in Winnipeg out to the suburbs. So we literally rebuilt them, which is not a municipal responsibility. And a city that had the highest per capita debt and the highest per capita taxes when I was mayor jumped into a complete environmental renewal and redevelopment of its waterfront, the development of the Esplanade Riel, because I run 2 software companies right now that do fiscal modeling of sustainability and infrastructure investments. So we do zero waste and zero carbon modeling, but we also do ecological and economic and fiscal output. So when we redesigned the waterfront, the vacancy rate in the historic center of the city and its beautiful old Victorian Edwardian warehouses and banking towers was 68%. 4 years later, when we finished the project, the $12 million that went just into the waterfront drive and waterfront cleanup generated $80 million in new taxes. The vacancy rate dropped from over 60% to less than 7%, and we rebuilt the tax base. And so a circular economy model, which many people talk about as being, moving to a regenerative economy, from shifting away from extracted resources, to recovered resources. We have enough aluminum in Eastern Canada to run the large smelter in Eastern Canada entirely on recovered aluminum out of our recycling and waste stream. If we did that, you could make aluminum with 80% less energy and materials of that would cost less than 20%, and you wouldn't have the racist exploitation of bauxite extraction in Jamaica that's destroyed so much of that country's livelihood, or a global supply chain that uses incredible amounts of energy. So the circular economy is also about circular economics. I did a lot of work with Jane Jacobs, who people may know as one of the world's great urbanists, who said city building is finding new purposes for old buildings. It's about building from within, not building out. And when you do that, you create a multiplier on your tax base. So we created a downtown development corporation to really take this circular economy approach to reinvesting and rebuilding from within. So when you have a vacancy rate over 50% in your downtown, you have a very weak commercial tax base, and your commercial tax base is the engine of your city finances. But when you do things that you even color us online, you get involved in post-secondary education. Red River College is built on photovoltaics, passive building design. Mountain Equipment Co-op is built 90. The store that went in right just down the street from it's built 96% out of waste materials. The Manitoba Hydro Place is the greenest building in the world, built with solar chimneys. It's the only building using advanced green technology at that level. This was all done when I was mayor. We built what are still three of the top 10 greenest buildings in the world are in Winnipeg. And we need to do that. Unfortunately, when I left, one of the mayors that came along later froze all of these programs. But the Downtown Development Corporation, by repurposing assets and using a circular economy, zero waste, usually and a zero carbon approach, generated $800 million in about 7 years for the city from the return on investment. Because when you take derelict abandoned buildings, where Red River College went, the buildings have been boarded up for 30 years, and you rebuild them, you have no cost. The services are there, the pipes are already in the ground. So, I mean, to give you an idea of what that means, when I was mayor, $3.5 million was 1% increase in taxes. So if you can generate $600, $700, $800 million from return on investments through brownfields and renewal and restoring your waterfront, you have a lot of fiscal room. So I try to, and I don't think this is an area the Green Party has explored. We have candidates that are talking about eco-socialism. We have candidates who are talking on the right about getting back to the sort of blue-green roots of the conservative wing of our party. I think we can go beyond that into a whole bunch of circular economy reinvestments, sort of a Jane Jacobs approach to place-based economics. When you repurpose assets and build from within, and put an end to sprawl. One of the biggest causes of pollution and carbon dioxide emissions are the fact that we have 30 years of sprawling, low-density, auto-centric suburbs. And one of our biggest challenges, if we're going to meet our 60% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030, isn't just going to be the enormous channel of just switching off fossil fuels and retrofitting buildings. It's going to be, how do we work with provinces to pull back 30 years of approvals for endless low density sprawl that increases the amount of land and energy that every Canadian uses. When I was born in 1957, we now use 8 times as much energy per person as we did the year I was born. And the year I graduated from university, which is the midpoint between now and then, we're using 4 times as much energy. So, I mean, if we cut our energy in half, our energy consumption in half, we would be using as much energy as we were in the mid-1980s, if that gives you an idea of
wow,
how bad the problem is.
Yeah, I didn't realize it had gotten that bad. That's interesting. Yeah, talking about the sprawl there, it's something I'm sure everybody in all of our viewers who are local here can relate to. It's Nanaimo is literally in city planning books, urban planning textbooks of an example of what not to do. I was told, somebody was in a class and they saw, I was like, this unnamed city, and it's like, hey, that's Nanaimo.
Well, it's also, I mean, we get back to just getting back really briefly to fiscal policy. I do a lot of consulting in this world where I've done urban planning and fiscal sustainability consulting from Portland, Oregon to Perm, Russia, and the Ural Mountains. And one of the 2 things I always look at is, what is the ratio of land and infrastructure per person? And the more land and the more infrastructure it takes to house a person or create a job is basically your carbon and your environmental footprint, but it's also your sustainability. The less compact and less walkable your city is, the more financially unsustainable it is, because every household has to support so much more land and so much more infrastructure that isn't being used very efficiently. It's very low density development is toxic environmentally, but it's also toxic to financial sustainability of a city. So, for a city like Nanaimo or a city like Winnipeg that really took the brakes off Sprawl over the last 10 years are going to have huge upward pressure on their taxes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we actually have I just wanted to let you know, we've actually got a fair number of questions left to get through here. There's some building up.
Okay, I'll give you very short answers from now on. How's that?
Not to rush yourself, but we'll trim it just a smidge. And just on that note, I actually had a question of my own, just about, so I'm not sure if this doesn't make sense, but it seems like a lot of what you're talking about right now is about city planning, and I don't know if I don't understand politics well enough to know this, but we're talking about leadership for a federal party here. How would you be able to even control these kinds of things aside from giving more funding to cities?
Well, exactly. So for 4 years in a row, when I was mayor of Winnipeg, I was elected by the 22 mayors of Canada's largest cities as the chair of the Big City Mayors Caucus and the lead negotiator. I negotiated 2 major agreements with the federal government. One was 5 cents a liter transfer of federal gas tax to municipalities, which was the largest investment ever by government in municipalities. And we need to do that. The federal government can devolve revenue to cities. And we got all cities' expenditures, one of the things I was able to do, exempted from the GST. And for the services side of cities, that was an incredible breakthrough. We also have had development agreements. Winnipeg has had the Winnipeg Development Agreement, which is a multi-billion-dollar federal, provincial, municipal agreement that actually brings together not just federal and provincial spending, but creates a coordinating organization and a plan. So when we saw that with the housing programs, which I was also one of the pioneers of, the federal government called it Skippy. It was where all federal and provincial authorities and benefits were given through a coordinated single window operation. Vancouver did very well with it. Victoria did very well with it. Provincially, for smaller municipalities, it was generally these programs were run through the Provincial Municipal Association, sometimes in Quebec run directly by the province. But that's really, really important. So the federal government, in Waterfront Toronto is an example. Montreal has a trilateral agreement on its waterfront that's been very successful. Winnipeg has had the core area initiatives 1 and 2 with the Winnipeg development agreements. They were probably over $15, $20 billion that had been spent over 25, 30 years. The opening up of the waterfront, the transfer of federal lands to municipalities. So the Kapiong Barracks, which has been turned over for First Nations, is one of the largest urban reserves. When I was mayor, we in Winnipeg and Saskatoon pioneered the first urban land treaty entitlement where First Nations could, in land treaty settlements, could actually claim sovereign lands in cities. They own large tracts of really cool development here. In Saskatoon, they own the Hilton Hotel and the region and the Royal Bank office tower in downtown Saskatoon. So there's also the role of the federal government with treaty settlements with First Nations who want to express their investments within municipal boundaries. There are protocols in a couple of provinces. There's a protocol in Manitoba that municipalities can sign on to. So there's lots of pathways to do those kinds of things. And the federal government has so much spending power that it can play a very significant role in urban renewal and housing renewal. Yep.
Great. Okay. So just so you're aware for time, thank you for that answer, by the way. You're very comprehensive. We have got about 5 or 6 more questions at least to get through in about the next 20 minutes.
Let's do rapid fire from now on.
Let's do rapid fire. Yeah. I'll give you a little wave when we're getting to about 3 minutes per answer. How about that? Okay, cool. So the next question we've got is about, and you've already touched on this, but there's been a critique from many in the renewable energy crowd. Sorry, I get this, I mix this up. Everybody, a lot of folks are saying that people in the renewable energy crowd just want to have perpetual growth, but make it just green growth instead. So you talked
Mm.
about circular economies. It seems like you are a fan of that. Do you think that we should have economic growth as the main goal of our economy, or should we be looking at steady state or even planned degrowth?
Well, I think what you need is you need to reintegrate cities. You need to use a circular economy, zero waste model of development. You need urban limit lines, and you need to repurpose already existing lands. So if one of the ways I think the national climate strategy should ask and should fund, the federal government should fund a circular economy, zero carbon, zero waste development plan for every single city. There's the Savvy system that was developed by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, a big global institute set up, interestingly, by Brian Mulroney, and there's two planning processes that we could quickly adopt that are used around the world. Savvy, which is the sustainable asset valuation model, which actually looks at the life cycles of infrastructure, energy systems, and city plans. And the other one is known as the Bellagio, nothing to do with the hotel in Las Vegas, but something called the Bellagio Stamp Assessments and Planning Tool, which is that. And then a company that I own, so I have to part owner of, which is Value Planning. We have a software package, which is one of the most popular in North America. Our largest client is the Environmental Protection Agency. So the Value Planning model, which builds in ecological and environmental outcomes into every infrastructure zoning and planning. So the very short answer to do this in under 3 minutes is simply that we should use these very advanced toolkits, and we should require that every municipality have an integrated circular economy and circular city plan, and that would avoid all of that problem of growth versus development and just excess energy. The problem is we consume more energy than almost anyone else in the world. We throw out more garbage than almost anyone else in the world. Everything of all 80% of what we buy we use once. 40% of what we buy we throw out within usually 3 or 4 minutes of using it. We cannot continue to waste resources. So this has to be a circular economy is more important than anything else. And if we were going to brand the Greens, I wouldn't brand us on the left, right. I would say we're the only party that isn't for a linear design for the dump economy. We are the only party that believes in an entirely circular economy and circular cities. And that's how we differentiate ourselves from all the other parties.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. If folks watching didn't know that, Glenn's totally right about the amount of garbage we produce. I saw a stat a while ago. I think it said we were #1 for municipal waste, but I don't remember the details.
We're #1 in the world, and we have about the worst diversion rate, and that we also have one of the lowest levels of productivity. That means that we use more energy and more materials for every unit of economic output than almost any other country. The 16 OECD peer countries were dead last. Of the G7, we're dead last. The United States is 25% more resource productive than we are, if that is not embarrassing enough. And by the way, if we corrected that problem, the average Canadian household would, per capita GDP would increase, but the average Canadian family would have $10,000 more disposable income if we close the productivity gap with other industrial countries.
Great. So the next question we've got is about this sort of contention in when Indigenous groups are actually for resource extraction, we'll say. So some Indigenous groups in Canada have been on the front lines of resisting fossil fuel development, while some others have embraced it and even partnered with these corporations or want to buy into the big projects they're doing. What do you think our approach, the Green Party Canada's approach, should be in regards to respecting Indigenous sovereignty in the cases that Indigenous nations are for these LNG, oil sands developments and pipelines like that, development of them?
Well, it's math. We have a crisis. Our parliament, in a bewildering moment, declared that we're in a climate crisis. To me, that's almost the equivalent of when you declare war. You when in 1939, we switched the entire industrial production of our country within about 24 months from making cars to making tanks and making building the third largest navy in the world, building aircraft. We completely changed the production of our entire economy in 2 to 3 years. We have to do that again. Carbon pricing isn't going to happen fast enough. We have to mandate electric vehicles. I don't own a car. Most people, I'm going to suggest about half of Canadians really don't need to own a car. I have a bicycle. And if we make massive investments in rapid transit and high-speed rail, we can increase that number. But we have to change our whole technology platform. We're at 415 parts per million. We're going to breeze past 2 degrees Celsius. And the problem is every degree Celsius increase in mean global temperature means things like forest fires in Australia that burn down 23% of the country's forests. Droughts in Brazil that collapse 60 to 85% of food production in the Fertile Crescent and lead to 8.6 million refugees.
Sorry,
climate change in the next climate change in the next.
Everyone gets this. Let's just focus in on the idea of Indigenous sovereignty and how we respect that.
But you work with Indigenous nations and sovereignty, but we're a sovereign nation too, and all sovereign nations in the world have to live within the ecological constraints. So, yes, you respect sovereignty. Yes, I respect that. That should all be negotiated. But when it comes to emissions in this country, to greenhouse gas pollution, that is the one thing that is non-negotiable. We all have a responsibility to keep this planet healthy and alive. And there's great evidence that. And the problem is we've let it go so far right now that the big carbon sinks, our oceans and our forests, are now in decline. And they're more consequential than human beings to the carbon cycle. So we're way past it. We're in a full-on crisis, and we have 10 years to globally get to a 60% reduction. And right now, Canada, which has no excuses, just saw its emissions jump by 15 megatons in its last report, and I'm going to guess probably by 30 megatons. We are absolutely in the worst existential crisis in human history. Sorry, it just blows away all those things. Nobody, I don't care whether you're Domtar or a First Nation, no one has the right to be contributing right now unless there's some essential life-saving piece, net emissions, which means that there's responsibility. We have to pay reparations to First Nations. We have to replace diesel in every community now with clean energy technology. There's a responsibility for us to First Nations to take many corrective measures and to respect their sovereignty, but nobody has a right to be dumping increased amounts of methane and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere anywhere in the world right now. That's got to stop now.
Yeah, it's an exigence, one might say.
Well, yeah.
So the next question that we've got is about systemic racism and police brutality. So I'm sure you are aware of George Floyd's death and the international protests that this has sparked, calling for defunding of police. So that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And it's sort of just thrown around there without really being defined. Do you support some form of defunding the police to address systemic racism and police brutality in general? And if so, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think we're getting caught up in an American dynamic and language that is really unhelpful. When I was mayor, I'll just give you an example. The police budget was 17, 18, 19% of the city budget. Today, it's 33%. It's almost doubled. We now have helicopters and surveillance policing and cruiser car responses. Back then, we had police working in teams with social workers, public health nurses, building and electrical and bylaws and housing inspectors, and they went out in teams and they solved problems in the neighborhood. We had community-led corporate, community development corporations that oversaw and delivered the affordable housing plans. We used to have a really integrated system for community housing. So what people call defunding police, if you said you wanted to cut the police budget back in half from 33% of the city budget to 16, 17, or 18%, you would be taking it down to the same percentage of the budget it was 15 years ago, which actually makes sense because parks and recreation and libraries and social services, community outreach and community health used to be about 50% of the city budget, the planning department. They're now about 33%. So, I mean, most of us don't even know our own histories of our own communities. We don't even know what we've lost. We don't know how many hours have been sheared off public libraries. But the complete model that has evolved of response, cruiser car, surveillance policing has to be dismantled immediately. Police have to be reinserted in communities under leadership of citizen-led groups and communities. We used to do that. David Crombie in Toronto, when I first got into politics in the 80s, I went to places like Minneapolis and Toronto to see community-based planning offices where the neighborhoods develop their own neighborhood plans. When I was an MPP in Toronto, all 9 neighborhoods in my constituency, I worked with the 2 city councils and we built community plans. And I had the most racialized riding just about in the country. I had 50% of all refugees and immigrants who come to Ontario landed in my downtown, our downtown Toronto riding. I had 30,000 Muslims who literally were, very few of them were more than a generation away from arriving. And so we worked on a community development model, which has also been dismantled largely in Canada. So it's not just, is there a need to significantly reduce and shift away from police-centered cities? Absolutely. Call it whatever you want. But let's actually talk about where we need to properly fund cities and why we need to finish the new deal for cities that we started and give cities new revenue sources and re-empower neighborhoods so people who live in neighborhoods control the future of their neighborhoods.
Right, absolutely. So we got a question from my friend, I'm assuming this is Hugh Thorburn because we've spoken about this in private. Hi, Hugh. Hugh in the chat's asking, in light of momentum for carbon taxes over cap and trade in Canada, why do you favor a cap and trade system over the fee and dividend model for a carbon tax advocated for by Envision Green? And just we've only got 8 minutes left here. We've got this question and a couple more to get through. So pretty brief.
I really don't actually care whether you call it fee and dividend, cap and trade, or carbon tax. It's not working. BC's emissions are going up. They're planning 9.6 megatons. So, and quite frankly, the difference between a carbon tax, a cap and a fee and dividend system makes sense to me because there's a social equity quality that I think is important. So a fee and dividend system, which is our party policy, should be part of any larger solution. Let's actually have a couple of things. I don't care what you call it. We need a carbon budget. We don't have a carbon budget. We have no legislated restrictions in Canada, unlike Norway or New Zealand, which Ontario, except for Quebec. So when I was Minister of the Environment, we had a carbon budget. You had to legally in Ontario, by law, by an act of Parliament, reduce your emissions by 4.3% per year. So have a carbon budget, have a legislative cap. BC doesn't have a legislative cap. It couldn't go up. A capped system, whether it's tax-based or a market-based system, has one difference. It's like musical chairs. You take a number of chairs away every year. So you have something called reduction certainty with a cap system. It means that the one thing that you're sure of is not what the price per ton of pollution pricing will be, but the amount that it will go down is important. So I think what's essential to any system in Canada is that you have reduction certainty. In BC, you have price certainty. The legislature sets the price. And the price right now in BC to level off and stabilize emissions would have to be $75 a ton. To get to 60% reduction, you're getting into $300 and $400 a ton. And cash flowing that through low income families, even with a guaranteed livable income, is going to be tough. So I put out a discussion paper on my website that tries to get beyond this ridiculous carbon fetishism about I'm for cap and trade, I'm for fee and dividend, I'm for carbon tax. It's all carbon pricing. And it either works or it doesn't. The Canadian system is a complete failure. Because under a cap system, everybody pays. Under a tax system, there's negotiated exemptions. The first thing the BC government did after it introduced its tax was it exempted the entire cement industry essentially from paying carbon pricing because BC lost a whole bunch of its cement production and now imports it from much dirtier plants outside BC, which is the same thing the Canadian government did. Catherine McKenna and Chrystia Freeland agreed to write down the responsibility for payment of the cement industry in Canada to 10%. You can't have a system that lets industry off the hook. You have to have a system that pools capital so that industry reinvests. So you have companies like, I'll conclude by this, like Nova Corporation, which ran a natural gas refining, investing $2.8 billion because under a trade-based system, when they get those reductions, they can immediately trade them to recapitalize and pay for the next generation of reductions. So the other feature that's really important is you need the ability for industry to pool capital and to buy new clean tech solutions. Our system right now doesn't do it. We do have a trading system within the federal carbon pricing system, but it's been a complete failure. So if we got started today, it would take us at least 2 years to get a system up and operating in Canada that would work. That means we have 8 years to get to a 60% reduction. Show me how we do it. I've got a plan. I haven't seen any other serious plan from any other leadership candidates. So you want to argue cap and trade with me, argue cap and trade. I'd rather argue with efficacy, and I'd rather have a serious conversation that's reality-based about getting to a 60% reduction, because I don't want to be part of a party that doesn't have a realistic plan to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Evidence-based approach. I mean, that's what our party is supposed to be all about, and that makes a lot of sense. So we got 2 questions left here, and we've only got 4 minutes. So this is rapid fire here. So from April is asking us in the chat, when did you join the Green Party and why then?
I joined the Green Party at the beginning of this year. I've done work for Green candidates. I helped Chris Tyndall, who ran in Toronto, because I came to the conclusion after everything blew up in the provinces, including the universal basic income, the dismantling of many of the carbon pricing and climate action systems, that the Green Party is the only serious party that is serious on things like poverty, ending poverty, and achieving greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and dealing with things like pesticides and other things I did. And if you look at my entire career, these are the things that I've worked on. I would not support the Liberal Party in Ontario today. Stephen Del Duca is not Kathleen Wynne. There is no universal basic income. There is no talking about significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The whole work, the referendum we had in Ontario on mixed member proportional representation has been completely savaged by the people who came after. So, political parties change so often now. I mean, Thomas Mulcair was a Liberal who became the leader of the NDP. Bob Rae was a New Democrat premier who became leader of the Liberal Party federally. I just think that I don't trust political parties. The Liberals have lied to us about everything from pipelines to electoral reform. I really believe the Green Party is the one hope we have, given the time we have. And I think it's going to depend on who the leader is, because I think that we could end up with a leader that isn't really that committed to this stuff. And to me, it's the content. It's what are we committed to? And I totally support 100% Green Party policy. I don't support the policies of the other parties. And I don't see another political home for myself. And I think there are millions of Canadians who feel exactly the way I do, who see a level of political maturity and emerging in the Green Party at the provincial and federal level that is very attractive, that people are taking us much more seriously now. Certainly I am.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that. So the last question we got like a minute left here, and then we're going to close after this question. So we've got a policy in the Green Party of reducing the voting age to 16, and some people are worried that teenagers are super irresponsible and unrealistic, that they wouldn't be able to handle that responsibility appropriately. So what are your thoughts on that?
Grumpy old men on the prairies voted for Andrew Scheer. How much more irresponsible could you possibly get than that?
Good answer.
I spent much of my life working with street kids, 80% who were sexually and physically abused at home. What they've seen in their lives, their thoughtfulness, their insightfulness, no, absolutely, 14, it's got to be. There's too much intergenerational inequity right now. There's just too much. We're the first generations, and I mean all of us. I mean, I know my friends who are millennials like to be off the hook on this, but we all bear responsibility. The generations before me and the one I'm part of more than any other, every other generation has honored the inheritance that they got from their parents by leaving their children a greater legacy than their inheritance. And we are the first generation in modern human history that is going to fail to do that. We're barely leaving our children a livable planet. And if you ask me what I want to do with the rest of my life, whether I win or lose this race, my entire life is going to be dedicated to this singular cause. If it's, Extinction Rebellion that I have to be on the front lines of and direct action, there is just nothing more important for any of us to be doing with our lives right now than confronting racism and poverty. And most importantly, not having a Thelma and Louise moment by driving over the climate change cliff. And the other parties are all talking about the speed at which we're going to go over that cliff. We've got to be the one party that's smart enough to know to hit the brakes and turn.
Absolutely. Thanks for saying that. I feel the same way. Nothing more important. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We're at 7:31 here, so we're actually over time. So sorry anybody if you missed the closing statements here, but I'm just going to let Glenn, if you've got anything else to say.
No.
Watch this. No.
We just got to do this, guys and gals. We have no time left. This is the most important moment in human history. We have to rise to it. It's a terrible thing we're looking at, but we can fix it. And we can develop a circular economy, which would be the most prosperous, equitable, inclusive economy and society with greater well-being and greater social justice. That's what we can create, or we can just go over the cliff. And this vote, this leadership vote, isn't just about electing a person. It's about electing the team and the individuals that could do that. So look very carefully at the experience and the ability of each of these candidates and pick the one that you really believe can deliver massive change and engage your heart and your soul and your mind and get people in the streets and get them in the workplaces and get people into legislatures that have had enough, who realize that this is insanity. We've got to stop it and we've got to change it now. That's it. Have a good evening. Get up tomorrow and start kicking ass.
Thanks, Glenn. Just for everyone watching, what's your website?
At glenmurray.ca. Read the End Poverty Now. They're all discussion papers. So everything I've written starts with Green Party policy, and it's an endorsement of it. And then most of the discussion paper is asking for your opinion, posing some questions. And then there's an implementation plan, which is how I think we can achieve each of the major planks in our program.
Great. Thanks, Glenn. And just for everyone watching, just as per usual, this is always going to be available on our YouTube channel, which is where you're watching it right now. Anybody who missed this, you can just share that link with them. They can check it out later. And we'll also be sending out these links to the future events in emails to the newsletter here. So thanks for watching, everybody, and have a great night.
And thank you for Paul Manley.
Yeah, we worked hard. Everyone watching worked hard.